There is a window in the gardening calendar that most American gardeners do not know exists. It is not spring when everyone is planting. It is not fall when the garden is winding down. It is right now, the weeks of July and early August, that most gardeners spend maintaining what is already in the ground, assuming that the planting season is essentially over and that anything going into the soil at this point is either a desperate late addition or a mistake. That assumption is costing those gardeners something they will not understand until next spring. When the neighbors who knew about this window have gardens that are already performing at full capacity, while everyone else is waiting for newly planted things to establish. The July planting window is real, it is specific, and it is one of the most powerful tools in the experienced gardener's calendar. Certain plants, perennials, bulbs, and specific shrubs establish faster and perform better when planted in summer than when planted in spring, because the warm soil temperatures of July accelerate root development in ways that the cold soil of early spring cannot match. A plant that goes into warm July soil has its root system actively growing, finding water, and colonizing the surrounding soil before the first cold arrives. That same plant installed in April is sitting in cold soil for weeks before root growth even begins, spending the entire spring in a holding pattern while the July planted version is already building the infrastructure that will produce next year's spectacular performance. 9 plants are on this list. Every one of them needs to go into the ground before this window closes, and stay until the very end, because the 9th plant on this list is one that most gardeners have never considered planting in July, and it produces a spring display so extraordinary that experienced gardeners who know this trick treat it as their most closely held gardening secret. That plant is coming. Do not leave before it arrives. Plant 1. Peonies, the July secret that produces spectacular springs. Forever peonies are sold in spring. They are displayed in spring. They are marketed as spring plants, and the gardeners who buy them in spring and plant them in spring are doing exactly what the garden center expects them to do. What those gardeners do not know, finer what almost no retail display communicates, is that peonies planted in spring almost never bloom the following year. The spring-planted peony spends its first season establishing in soil that was too cold at planting time to support rapid root development, and it enters its first winter with roots that have not had enough time to anchor properly or build the energy reserves that bloom production requires. It blooms weakly in year 2, if at all, and reaches full performance in year 3 or 4. A peony planted in July does something completely different. The warm soil temperatures that July provides accelerate root establishment in a way that April never can. The tuberous roots that make peonies so permanent and so productive, those thick, fleshy storage organs that fund decades of bloom production, begin growing immediately in warm soil, colonizing the surrounding area with a vigor that cold soil spring planting cannot approach. By the time the first frost arrives, a July-planted peony has root contact with a significantly larger volume of soil than a spring-planted specimen of the same age. It enters winter better established, exits winter with larger energy reserves, and produces its first real bloom display in the spring that follows. One season earlier than the spring-planted version, the planting depth rule that determines peony success is the same regardless of when the planting happens. But it matters more in summer because the warm soil makes everything happen faster, including the consequences of getting it wrong. The eyes, the pink growth buds on the tuberous roots, must be planted no more than 1 to 2 inches below the finished soil surface. Eyes planted deeper than 2 inches produce foliage indefinitely without flowering, regardless of how healthy the plant appears. In warm July soil, this depth matters more because the roots establish so quickly that correcting a planting depth error later becomes difficult. Get the depth right at planting, water deeply after installation, and mulch to moderate the soil temperature around the newly planted roots. Then step back and let the July soil do the work that spring soil never could. Plant 2. Ornamental grasses, the fall display. That starts now ornamental. Grasses planted in July are ornamental grasses that put on a fall display this year rather than next year, and this distinction, planting this season's performer rather than next season's potential, is what makes July the correct month for grass installation. A grass planted in April spends the spring establishing, produces modest growth through summer, and often looks unremarkable through its first fall season, while the root system is still finding its footing. A grass planted in July in warm soil has its roots actively growing through August and September, producing the above-ground growth that creates the seed heads, the movement, and the autumn light-catching qualities that make ornamental grasses one of the most valuable fall garden plants available. Carl Forster feather reed grass, planted now, produces its characteristic upright golden plumes in September and October of the same season. Miscanthus sinensis, in its many cultivars, develops the arching seed heads that catch the autumn light, with that characteristic luminous quality by late September when planted in July. Pennisetum alopecuroides, fountain grass, produces its bottle brush-like seed heads through fall, providing movement and texture exactly when the summer flowers are finishing, and the garden needs something to carry it through the transitional weeks. Every one of these grasses planted now contributes to this year's garden rather than only to next year's, the establishment advantage that July provides for ornamental grasses is significant because grasses are among the plants that respond most dramatically to warm soil temperature. The C4 photosynthetic pathway that the warm season grasses use, the same biochemical mechanism that makes prairie dropseed thrive in summer heat, operates at maximum efficiency in the soil temperatures of July and August. Roots laid down now in warm soil develop faster, penetrate deeper, and build larger root mass than roots laid down in cold spring soil. The grass that is planted today is building the root system that will make next year's display extraordinary, while simultaneously contributing to this year's fall garden. 2 seasons of return from one July planting decision. Plant 3. Echinacea, the self-seeder that needs warm soil to establish. Echinacea purpurea planted in July blooms this summer. Not next summer, not the summer after that, but the same season it goes into the ground, because July planted Echinacea from a well-grown nursery container is already a blooming-sized plant that simply needs warm soil to root into its new location and continue doing what it was already doing in the pot. The bloom that happens this August and September from a July-planted Echinacea is not a compromised establishment year performance. It is the full display of a mature plant that has found warm soil and expanded into it. The more consequential advantage of July Echinacea planting is what happens the following spring. The root system that establishes through July, August, and September in warm soil before the first cold arrives is substantially larger and more extensive than the root system of a spring-planted Echinacea that spent its first months in cold, slow-growing soil. That larger root system funds a more spectacular second-season bloom. More flower stems, more flowers per stem, more seed production. And more seed production means more self-seeding into the surrounding area through the fall and winter, more germination the following spring, and a faster expanding colony that begins filling the bed with that butterfly-attracting midsummer display years ahead of what spring planting would have achieved. The self-seeding behavior that makes Echinacea such a valuable long-term garden. Investment, the quality that allows one plant to become a colony. Without any division, replanting, or additional purchase, depends on the plant having enough time in its first season to produce mature, viable seed. July planting gives Echinacea exactly that time. The flowers that open in August and September on a July-planted Echinacea produce seeds that mature fully before the first hard frost, disperse into the surrounding soil, and germinate the following spring. The spring-planted Echinacea, by contrast, often produces flowers too late in its first season for the seeds to fully mature before cold arrives. delaying the self-seeding cycle by an entire year. Plant 4. Hellebore, the shade treasure that roots best in summer. Warmth hellebore is the plant that most gardeners discover they want in August, when they walk past a garden that has them and realize that those extraordinary nodding flowers in February and March, blooming when nothing else in the garden is alive, are exactly what the winter landscape has always been missing. And the gardener who discovers hellebore in August and acts on that discovery immediately, planting before the July window fully closes, is the gardener who will have those February flowers next year. The gardener who waits until next spring to plant hellebore will wait 2 years for the same display, because hellebore, planted in spring, rarely blooms in the winter immediately following installation. The reason that summer planting produces earlier bloom in hellebore is the same reason it produces earlier bloom in peonies. Warm soil drives root establishment at a rate that cold spring soil cannot match. Hellebore roots are thick and fleshy, evolved for the cool woodland conditions of their European and Asian origins, and they establish best when given warm soil in which to spread before encountering their first cold season. A hellebore planted now has 3 to 4 months of active root growth before temperatures drop, building a root system large enough to support flower bud formation over winter and bloom production in February. A spring-planted hellebore has the same winter ahead of it with a fraction of the root mass, and the bloom buds that require that root investment to form simply do not develop. The location that hellebore needs, partial to full shade. Consistently moist, organically rich soil is often the location that is most difficult to plant in spring because the deciduous trees that create those shade conditions are leafless in early spring, and the dappled light conditions that hellebore requires are not yet present. In July, those same trees are in full leaf, the shade conditions are exactly what they will be through the growing season, and the gardener can accurately assess the light levels that hellebore will experience year-round. Plant in the location that matches the conditions now, in summer when the conditions are visible, rather than guessing at spring what summer shade will look like. This is the midpoint of this list, and here is the most important thing to understand about everything that has been described so far. The July window is not infinite. It closes as summer progresses. The warm soil temperatures that make July planting so powerful for root establishment begin to moderate in September, and the plants on this list that establish fastest and perform soonest when planted now become slower establishing and later performing with every week that passes. The gardeners who are watching this video right now and act on what they are seeing within the next 2 to 3 weeks are the gardeners who will have the spring garden that makes everyone else ask what they did differently. Drop a U.S. state or hardiness zone in the comments right now, because gardeners in the same region reading those comments are making the same July decisions and can share what is working where they are. Plant 5. Daylilies. The division that establishes in one-season daylilies, divided and replanted in July, establish so quickly in warm soil that they bloom the following season at full capacity, without the year of establishment that spring-divided plants typically require before returning to peak performance. The fan divisions that are separated from a mature clump in July and immediately replanted in warm soil root aggressively through August and September, building the root mass that supports full bloom production the following summer. Spring-divided daylilies, by contrast, spend their first season recovering from the division stress in cold soil and rarely produce more than a few blooms in the season. Immediately following division, this makes July the ideal month for 2 distinct daylily operations: dividing and expanding existing plantings, and installing new varieties from nursery containers. Both benefit from the warm soil establishment advantage, and both produce better first-season performance than the same operations performed in spring. The new daylily variety installed now from a nursery pot has its roots in warm soil before October arrives, giving it 3 months to establish before winter dormancy. That same variety installed in April has its roots in cold soil for most of its first growing season, spending energy on temperature adaptation rather than root establishment. For gardeners who want to expand their daylily plantings without purchasing new plants, July is the month to divide existing mature clumps and redistribute the divisions throughout the garden. The divisions root rapidly in July soil, fill in new areas of the planting before fall, and bloom at full capacity the following summer, an entirely free expansion of the daylily display accomplished in one afternoon with a sharp spade and the warm soil that makes the whole operation successful. Plant 6. Sedum, the fall bloomer. That needs to establish now sedum. Specifically, the upright border sedums now classified as Hylotelephium, including Autumn Joy, Matrona, and Brilliant. Bloom in August, September, and October. Planting them now, in July, gives them exactly the establishment window they need to produce their fall display this season rather than next season. A sedum installed in July from a vigorous nursery container is already building the root system in warm soil that will support the flat pink flower heads that deepen through rose and copper into the antique tones of fall. That same sedum, planted in April in cold soil, spends the spring in establishment mode and often produces a reduced first-season bloom. The succulent leaf tissue that makes sedum so drought-tolerant also makes it particularly forgiving of summer planting conditions. It carries its own water supply in the thick, water-storing leaves that maintain turgor pressure through the establishment period without requiring the constant moisture that less drought-adapted plants need after transplanting. A sedum planted in July needs deep watering at installation, a second deep watering a week later if rainfall has not been adequate, and then essentially nothing else. The water storage capacity of its own leaves sustains it through the establishment period, and the warm soil drives root development into the surrounding area faster than any spring-planted specimen achieves. By September, a July-planted sedum is an established plant, producing its characteristic flat flower heads in the pink tones of early fall color. By October, those heads have deepened to the copper and bronze tones that make sedum the most sophisticated color in the fall garden palette. And by the following spring, the crown has grown significantly larger than it was at planting, committing itself to a second-season bloom that exceeds the first in every measurable dimension. More stems, more flower heads, more structural presence in the garden. Plant it now and it performs this fall. Leave it alone and it performs better every fall after that. Plant 7. Rudbeckia, the self-spreading colony. That starts today. Black-eyed Susan planted in July is black-eyed. Susan that blooms in August and September of the same season. Self-seeds into the surrounding soil before winter arrives and begins the colony expansion process that eventually covers an entire bed with golden midsummer color, all from a plant installed in the ground right now. The warm soil that July provides drives root establishment so rapidly in Rudbeckia that plants installed from nursery containers in July are producing flowers within weeks of planting, behaving less like newly installed transplants and more like established plants that have simply been moved to a new location. The self-seeding. That makes Rudbeckia such a valuable long-term investment depends on the plant having enough growing season after installation to produce mature, viable seeds before frost arrives. July installation gives Rudbeckia exactly that timeline. Flowers in August and September, seed maturation in October, seed dispersal through fall and early winter, germination the following spring. The new plants that emerge from those seeds bloom the summer after they germinate, filling the bed with golden color from plants that cost nothing and required nothing beyond the initial installation of their parent, the colony. Behavior that Rudbeckia exhibits over successive seasons, expanding by both rhizome spread and self-seeding. To fill available soil with golden midsummer color, starts its clock the moment the plant goes into warm July soil. Every week that passes without planting is a week of colony-building time lost. The gardener who plants now starts a process that will produce an expanding, self-sufficient, wildlife-supporting planting that fills the garden with abundance for decades. The gardener who waits until next spring starts the same process 1 year later. Plant 8. Catmint, the rebloomer that establishes. Fast in heat catmint, Nepeta X Fasani, establishes faster in warm summer soil than almost any other perennial on this list, and the establishment speed it demonstrates in July is directly connected to the reblooming performance it delivers in fall of the same season. A catmint installed in July from a nursery container roots into warm soil aggressively, builds its woody crown base through August and September, and often produces a flush of lavender blue, flowers in September and October, of its very first season in the ground, a fall bonus from a plant that has barely had time to introduce itself to its new location. The woody crown that catmint builds over successive seasons, the accumulating basal structure that produces more vigorous growth and more abundant bloom every year, begins developing the moment the plant goes into warm July soil. Root establishment in warm soil is the foundation of that crown development, and July provides the most favorable conditions for that foundation to be laid quickly and thoroughly. A catmint planted in spring in cold soil builds its crown slowly through a cautious establishment period. A catmint planted in July builds it aggressively through weeks of warm soil root development before the first cold arrives. By the time winter comes, a July-planted catmint has a woody crown that is significantly more developed than a spring-planted specimen of the same age. That development translates directly into a more vigorous emergence in the following spring, a more robust first bloom flush in May and June, and a faster and more complete rebloom after the summer cutback. The catmint that was planted in July performs like a second-year plant in its first spring, because in terms of crown development and root mass, it essentially is one, plant 9, the one. Most gardeners have never considered planting in July tulip bulbs. Starting the pre-chilling process right now. This is the plant that was promised at the beginning of this video, and it requires a different explanation than everything else on this list because the July action it requires is not planting. It is purchasing and refrigerating. Tulip bulbs need a cold dormancy period, a minimum of 12 to 16 weeks at temperatures below 45 degrees Fahrenheit, before they can bloom. In most American climates, the ground provides this cold period naturally when bulbs are planted in October or November. But gardeners in zones 8, 9, and 10, the American South, the Gulf Coast, California, and the Pacific Southwest, do not get enough natural soil cold for tulip bulbs to bloom reliably. And most of those gardeners have simply accepted that tulips are not for their climate. They are wrong. The technique that experienced gardeners in warm climates use to grow tulips is called pre-chilling, and it begins right now, in July, with bulbs purchased from a reputable bulb supplier and placed in a paper bag in the vegetable crisper drawer of the refrigerator. 12 to 16 weeks of refrigeration at 35 to 45 degrees provides the cold treatment that the soil will not. The bulbs that go into the refrigerator in July come out in October or November, go into the ground and soil that is cool enough to support them, and bloom in February and March with the same spectacular display that Zone 5 gardeners get from October planted. Bulbs that chill in the ground all winter. The gardeners in warm climates who learn this technique in July and act on it immediately, purchasing bulbs now while summer selections are available, starting the refrigeration period now, while the full 16 weeks before optimal planting time is still available, are the gardeners who will have tulips blooming in their February gardens while their neighbors accept that tulips are simply not possible in their climate. The gardeners who see this video in August and think they will start the process then have shortened the pre-chilling period by a month and reduced the bloom reliability accordingly. The window for the full pre-chilling process that produces the most reliable bloom is right now. The bulbs go in the refrigerator today. They go in the ground in October. They bloom in February, and the neighbor who stops on the sidewalk to ask how tulips are growing in a Zone 9 garden in February does not get a complicated answer, just a smile from a gardener who knew about a window that most gardeners miss entirely: 9 plants. 9 reasons to be at the garden center this week rather than next month. The July window that most gardeners do not know about closes gradually as summer progresses, and the plants on this list become less powerful performers with every week of warm soil temperature that passes unused. The gardeners who act now plant once into warm soil and watch the rewards arrive, this fall, next spring, and every season after that. The gardeners who wait plant into cooling soil and wait another year for the same returns. If this video helped, hit subscribe to join this gardening community and watch the next video on screen to keep making the decisions that separate the gardens that improve every season from the ones that stay the same.